Hello everybody, Huss here with The Perfect Story. We're on video 3, hooks and endings. And if you're just coming in and you haven't seen the schedule of videos that are going to release, this is it right here. So let's start with some definitions. First of all, this is about hooks and endings. So the hook is it's called the inciting incident in most craft books. And it occurs early in the beginning. It's just a really cool thing that happens early in the beginning that gets your reader's attention. And of course, the ending starts with the crisis and ends with the denouement. And that's just like an epilogue kind of final scene in the whole book that wraps things up at the end. The hook can predict the ending, but it doesn't have to, as long as something in the beginning ties back to the ending. And you can remember that from the very first video where I kind of hammered this point home, that really good books tie these two things together in some way and gives the reader a sense of completion and that everything that you wrote in the book has meaning. And the hook is exactly what it sounds like. For example, in Star Wars, it's when Luke Skywalker buys 2 droids. In The Silence of the Lambs, it's when Clarice is sent to interview Hannibal Lecter. In The Martian, it's when Mark Watley is stranded on Mars. And in Fight Club, it's when the narrator meets Tyler Durden. In Taking Turns, my book, it's when Quinn finds Chella in Rochelle's bed. And a really good hook, it's not going to deter probably a whole lot of people if you have a really good beginning. But it can grab people that you might not get. So it's a really good idea to have a good hook in the beginning of your book. So we're going to add this into our little graph, and we're going to modify our story structure once again. The hook is actually a peak and a valley at the very beginning of your book, and then you start building to the 25% point. The ending starts with a crisis, goes through a thing I call the regroup. Then you have a high-tension peak called the climax, and of course the ending called the denouement. So we talked about how the book is really divided into 3 parts, beginning, middle, and end. The beginning is the first 25% mark in your book. The middle is middle 50%. And right around 75%, you start this thing called a crisis. Now you can play around with this percentage point a little bit in novels. You don't have to have it at the 75% mark. I've had it as late in the 80s sometimes. It really depends on the book and the plot. So if you're finding yourself hard to keep that crisis at 75% and it gets pushed a little farther into the book, I think that's fine as long as it fits your story. The ending really has 4 guideposts, which is the crisis, that's the moment when all hope is lost. The regroup, that's when the main character comes up with a new plan. The climax is the amazing solution to the last problem. And of course the denouement, which ties up all the loose ends. The ending is a quick series of peaks and valleys. They happen pretty quickly. If you notice in the beginning, you have 25% of your book to build to that first plot point. Well, in the ending, you're mixing all these 4 components together in that same 25%, or maybe even less. So all this stuff is happening pretty quickly. The most important part of the ending is going to be your climax, because that is the point where everything comes together. So that's where you pull off the impossible and deliver on all your promises to the reader. If you fail to deliver to your readers, they will be left unsatisfied. And I cannot even tell you how important this is, because I've read a lot of books lately where the ending just doesn't do it for me, and it kind of ruins the whole book. I've also read one recently that added in a plot point that I don't think really needed to be there, because this particular author did not tie it up at the end, just left it open for interpretation, which authors tend to do a lot in literary fiction, and I really don't know why they do that, because I don't think anybody fucking likes it, right? If you're going to introduce a plot point, make it have meaning. If you introduce something as big as this was, it was huge. It was a very big, like, what if in this story, and she just left it undone, like never answered the question. And that's all you could think about is the end is, well, what was it or wasn't it? And you never get an answer. So that's just very unsatisfying. So yeah, if you're writing literary fiction, go for it, I guess. and I guess you're not concerned about your reader's satisfaction, but if you're writing genre fiction, you really can't do that because most genre fiction has rules, and one of the rules is it's got an ending. So in the beginning, use your hook to set up your end, and in the end, resolve the main conflict and give your readers a proper denouement. And once again, your ending must be satisfying. I love this quote from Aristotle because he says that the end of an effective plot must be unexpected but inevitable, and that means that when your reader looks back on the story, they realize that everything you did had meaning and led up to this point in time, and there's no other way that this book could have ended. There's just no other way, and that's what the inevitable part means. And it's really important because readers come away thinking, this author really knows what she's doing and took me on a ride with a purpose. And now that I'm at the end, I understand why all these things happened. Okay, let's take a little time out for romance, because romance has a lot of rules, and one of them is you have to have a happily ever after. And all romance readers know there will be a happily ever after. If you're not writing a happily ever after, you're not writing a romance, you're writing something else. But if all the readers wanted was the happily ever after, it wouldn't matter what your plot was. And obviously the plot matters, or all books would be created equal. So how you get to the end really, really does matter. I'm going to go through the book 321 to kind of illustrate this. And as I said in the last video, most of my books have 3 plots plus a romance. So in 321, the main character Ark is hiding a secret, the other main character JD is dealing with a past mistake, and the other main character Blue is recovering from her captivity. They all 3 are falling in love in this threesome arrangement and trying to live together as not a couple, obviously, because it's 3 people, but as a threesome. So in the end of 321, I'll just say that the end of 321 is really what makes this book. Because I have pointed out to you in other videos that I had a few books that I think I plotted perfectly, and 321 was not one of them. Because I feel there's things in the middle that I could have done better. But the ending is perfect. And the ending is when JD is wrecked by the mistake that happened a few years earlier, which resulted in the death of his girlfriend and his baby being sold to black market baby sellers. But this is the information that the reader gets throughout the middle of the story. But in the ending, there's a twist because they find out that JD is the one who sold his baby and resulted in his girlfriend's death. And this is the whole reason why Ark was afraid he was suicidal through the whole book. And at the end, JD kills himself when Blue confronts him when she finds out that this is actually what's going on. So how I got to the happily ever after is the only thing that mattered in 321. The readers really liked JD because he was charming and he was the fun-loving one. But they knew because of my blurb that there was something was going to happen at the end. And the way I got to the final happily ever after was what made this book great. And my blurb, my little tagline on my cover was, "Not everything should come in threes." And so they knew that even though this is being touted as a 3 soulmates book, love story, it wasn't going to end that way. And I think I made that pretty clear all the way through. And so they were hoping, they were wrong, but they weren't. So how you get to the end really, really does matter. If I could give you one piece of advice, I would tell you not to be afraid to write epic endings. The hook is what makes the reader give you a chance and read your book. But the end is what keeps the readers coming back and turns them into fans. So you really, really need to take a lot of time on the ending and the hook to get your reader interested in how you like to tell a story. And what I would suggest is you go grab your favorite book. It doesn't matter what genre it is. It doesn't matter which book it is. But you should read it again, and you should write down while you're reading what you love about it. In almost every case, you're going to come back and say it was the ending. But it's not just the end that you love. Most of the time, people are going to say, you love the way that the author got to the end. And this is why I say good books tie the beginning to the end. Because readers want to feel like you know what you're doing, this was a purposeful plot, and you took them on a ride and everything had meaning. So once again, your guidepost for the ending. The crisis is the moment when all hope is lost. The regroup is when the main character comes up with a new plan to solve the crisis. The climax is when they put that amazing solution into action, and solve the last problem, and the denouement is when they tie up the loose ends. So let's go through what is a good crisis. Of course, this is different in every genre, so keep that in mind. But basically, your characters are challenged in a unique and believable way where everything is at stake and your reader feels like failure is inevitable. They call this the dark moment in a lot of cases. The regroup is when your main character figures out a way to fix things and put things into motion to solve the final conflict. That's the solution. And the solution should involve significant risk. Now, if you're writing action-adventure, this could be a death of the main character or a death of somebody important to the main character. In a romance, it could be this relationship is not going to work. There's a lot of ways to think of that. But it needs to be a solution to the final problem. And one thing I would caution you with writing solutions is that even if you have a very complicated solution and very complicated plot, you really need to make it clear in the regroup section of your book how you're going to solve this problem. And even if you keep a secret from your reader, like I do this a lot, keep a secret from the reader so that they don't get that final solution until the very end, you should set it up so once they get the solution, they can follow along with little effort. You don't want to confuse them at the end. Now, I've read, in fact, my favorite book of all times has a very confusing solution and regroup. But it was just so great I didn't care. And I actually have read that book several times. And each time I read it, I'm like, yeah, it makes total sense. But then later I always forget. I always think, no, it didn't make sense. So you really got to try your best to keep the solution spelled out as simply as possible while still keeping the mystery and intrigue going until you decide to end the book. So the reader wants to believe that the solution will work, but they should be preparing themselves for the ultimate tragedy. If they know the solution's going to work and they feel in their heart, this is all going to work out, they're going to put the book down. I do that all the time. All the time I get to the crisis and then I'm like, well, I just lose interest. So you don't want to do that. You want to keep them reading. What makes a good climax? Again, unexpected but inevitable. I got an amazing response from 321 Book and amazing reviews from fans because they fell in love with all three characters. They wanted to believe, even though I told them in the blurb, that three soulmates could really happen. And they never expected me to kill JD in the end. But of course I did. And JD's suicide in front of Blue and Arc was the only way this plot could resolve. He was never going to forgive himself, he was never going to heal, and this threesome was never going to last. But I pulled it off in the denouement because I followed through with unexpected but inevitable. And even though you're not allowed to kill a main character in a romance, readers forgave me because I gave them the perfect denouement. I wrote a very non-traditional romance and ended it with a very traditional happily ever after. So that's how I pulled it off. And I'm not going to lie and say you could do that in every case, but this story was just set up and it allowed for it. Okay, we're going to go through two books, and I call this Anatomy of an End, and I'm going to go through two different books. And I'm not really going to explain the plots too much because they're just way too complicated. But I want to show you two different examples of how to set up an ending. And I have two completely different kinds of books. The first one is one of my sci-fi books. It's called Fledge. It's number 2 in the I Am Just Junko series. It's a sci-fi thriller with very high action and it's plot-driven. And the second one is a book called Taut. It's Ruken Ronin number 5. And it's a romantic suspense with very low action and it's all character-driven. So I'm going to give you two examples of this. And again, the anatomy of the end includes the crisis, the recovery, the climax, and the ending sequence. And I say sequence in all of these because, for me at least, there's not just one scene. Or if you're doing dual point of view, it's not just one scene for her and one scene for him. I usually do a long sequence for each one of these things, and that's what I'm going to show you. Two different ways to do it in this little example. And my plots are very complicated, so keep that in mind. And once again, if you're going to do a complicated plot with a complicated solution, you need to keep the solution simple. It doesn't have to be, actionably simple, but you need to use the right words to explain to your reader so that in their head they think it's simple. I hope that makes sense. I'm not telling you not to have a complicated solution at all. I'm telling you to explain it to the reader in very easy terms in just the right, sentences that can firmly establish that they understand what's going to happen or what is happening in the climax. So the first book is called Fledge. Like I said, sci-fi thriller, high action, and it's plot driven. So of course, I'm not going to go through all these plot points because it doesn't make sense. If you didn't read the book, you're not going to understand. But I just want you to see them and know that before we get to the crisis, a lot of things happen. We have a beginning and a middle. So then we begin the crisis. And as I said, I usually have a sequence of crises that happen at the same time. And this book is a perfect example because I actually have 4 very, very big crises happening pretty much all at the same time at the 75% mark. And each one of them, like the first one starts out pretty bad, but they just get bigger and bigger and bigger until the final one happens. And your reader is just like, wow, I just don't see how this can ever turn out right. So that's what you want them to feel. You want them to feel no hope at all. And then I have a sequence of recovery scenes. And in this particular book, there are 6 total scenes that make up the recovery sequence in the regroup. That's what I'm calling the regroup in my 4 guideposts. So they get, it's a really complicated book, so I'm not even going to get into the plot of it. But just know that I have 6 of them, all stacked one upon the other in that whole regroup section. And the bottom line is that the reader comes away knowing there is a plan. I don't explain the plan to them at all because that would ruin the ending. But they know there is a plan and they feel like Junko has something up her sleeve and somehow she's going to pull this off even though it looks like it's impossible. Then I have a sequence of climaxes. So it's not just one ending that I planned in this book. I had actually 6 major points at the climax where all the things needed to resolve because, as I said, it's a very long, complicated book. So the reader knows there is resolution, but still no ending. Time out, because I'd like to point out that everything in the recovery and the climax was set up earlier in the book. Everything that I listed in that list of recovery and climax sequences, every single point was mentioned before I got to the 75% point in the book. And I think I mentioned that in the last video that you cannot introduce something new at the end of the book. So even if you just mention it in 1 or 2 sentences in the beginning or in the middle, that's great. But you have to have set it up before you get to that point in the book. Otherwise, readers feel like you just pulled it out of your ass and you just made it up as you went. And you don't want them to think that. You want them to think that you set this up on purpose. So the ending sequence, as I said, I've been reading a lot of books lately where there's no ending. And it's like, what the fuck, And most of these are sci-fi literary fiction. And I guess this is what editors seem to be looking for because they're traditionally published books. But it's not what I'm looking for as a reader. So even though I finished the book, I was, not motivated to go leave a raving review for these things because I just felt unsatisfied at the end. So don't forget to end your book. If you presented a problem in the book, you have to find a solution for it. The only time you don't have to find a solution for it is if this is a book in a series and you have already planned on solving that problem in a later book. We're going to talk more about series coming up soon, and that's perfectly fine. But if you don't have a series and this is a standalone book, or you don't plan on carrying that problem through, then you need to solve it in this story right here. So there are 2 types of endings, as I said. We went through the first book that was plot-driven. The Fledge book was set up to stack the crises on top of one another for maximum dramatic effect because it is a plot-driven book. But in the Tot book, because it's character-driven, I set it up totally differently. I set it up as a series of crises, solving them along the way for maximum character development. So the ending sequence for Junko is, I had 3 resolutions, and I'm not going to go through them like I said, because you just don't understand the plot if you haven't read it. But there were 3 resolutions at the end where every loose end that I could think of for this particular book were tied up. Now this particular series has a lot of mystery, and this is only book 2, and there are several books after this one, so there are still lots of mystery left in the book. But all the major conflicts in this book, when it started, were all resolved at the end, and there was actually a little happily ever after at the end of this one, which didn't happen in the other ones in the series until the very last book. So there was a completion of Junko's character arc, where she started this book thinking she knew the difference between good and evil, and she knew who is on which side, and at the end she realizes no, she has no idea what good and evil really means, and there are many shades of gray between these two things, and you can always have somebody more evil than the person you think is evil. And so that was her character arc that resolved at the end of the book. Junko Fledge was a textbook example of structure, and in that I mean that the beginning was exactly 25%, the middle was exactly 50%, and the ending was exactly 25%. But as I have said earlier, I think you can play around with the ending. It really depends on the type of story you have, or whether or not you can really fill in 25% of your book with those 4 sequence events, those guideposts. Because sometimes in a romance, you can't stretch it out that long. You just can't. So you have to play around with it a little bit at the end. But don't think that you can do that in the beginning and the middle, because you can't. You still have to try and follow the rules up until that point. So the second anatomy of the end is the taught book. And as I explained in the Junko book, there's a beginning where lots of shit happens. We have a beginning and a middle, and then we begin the crisis. And in this particular book, I stacked the crises with the recoveries one on top of each other. So I had, and this was not the recovery section. It was just I was solving the crises along the way. That's all I was doing. So I had one crisis, which is a problem, and then I had one recovery, which is a solution. And I did that 3 times. So by the time we get to the climax, there's also 3 climax scenes, and how the problems in this book get solved. And they happen stacked one on top of each other. And then there is the resolution to the end, which is all the loose ends are tied up. And the character arc for Ford is that he learns that starting over is possible. And the beginning of the book starts with him running away from something, and the ending of the book has him coming to terms with what he was running from and starting something new. So make sure you keep your theme in mind and tie the beginning to the end. When I plot a book, everything is done with purpose. If this, then that. The story starts with a goal, and by the end of the book, the reader understands the purpose of the story. Every scene has a goal, and every scene leads to the ending. All words enhance the theme. So keep that in mind. That's why I think theme is so important. And if you have a theme, it's so much easier to write the book because you know why you're writing it. If you don't have a theme, you can often find when you get to the end that you do have one, you just didn't know it. But wouldn't it be nicer if you were writing along your theme the whole time so you didn't have to second guess yourself or wonder where you're going next with that thing or how this character should act? So all words should enhance the theme, and you really should go in knowing what that is. If you're writing romance, the end is where you present a dark moment where the relationship falls apart. That's the crisis. Have both characters realize something profound, which is the recovery. Make your hero give your heroine a grand gesture, which is the climax, and then give them their perfect happily ever after, which is the denouement. So the take-home point is that your hook should be original. The hook is what makes people keep reading. It's the look inside sample. It can set up the end, but it doesn't have to, and it should be clever. Every plot has been done, but not every plot has been done your way. And also, one more point, the amount of tension, drama, and conflict depends on your genre or subgenre. So if you're writing military science fiction, then your tension, drama, and conflict is going to be way off the charts compared to somebody who's writing romantic comedy, because they're just 2 completely different types of books. And the take-home point for your ending is that they should be intense. The crisis has the most tension, drama, and conflict in the whole story to that point. But that's not enough, because the climax must have even more. Remember your plot graph where the little peaks and valleys are going up the incline. And you notice that the climax is higher than the crisis. That's because the energy is higher there. And also your denouement should be original and satisfying. So once again, the guideposts are the crisis, the regroup, the climax, and the denouement. And don't leave any of these things out. It's really important that you put them all in. So, plotting a book. We've gone through beginnings, middles, and endings, and hooks and scenes so far. And you want to hook them in the beginning, plant clues for the end. You want to present and solve problems in the middle in a stepwise manner to build tension, drama, and suspense. You want to have a series of complex problems as your crisis, and by complex, again, it really depends on your genre or subgenre, and you want to make each one worse than the last. So if you're, wondering, well, how do I do that in a romance if it's not, epic and mind-blowing? I don't know. A problem could be anything. You get a drink spilled on a dress. That's a problem. You can solve it. Versus something in like sci-fi military where people are getting killed. So keep that in mind. It's all relative compared to your genre or subgenre and your plot. And you want to make each problem worse than the last. Make your character plan how to solve them. Solve the crisis problems in a unique way, and then make sure you have a proper ending that ties back to the beginning in order to keep your reader satisfied. One more thing is about the bullshit fluff. I'm going to go through this again. It's boring, and readers always know, so don't do it. Because you're on a 5-year plan, right? If you want to be here in 5 years, and I said this in the perfect year for the marketing videos, then you have to plan it. And so forget about all those people who are writing stupid porn and are making tons of money right now. If you want to go write stupid porn, feel free, go for it. But if you want to be here in 5 years because you have an actual career, then you better make sure that the books you're writing have meaning if you don't want to start all over with a pen name. So ask yourself when you're plotting, do you want to be here in 5 years? And if you do, then plot something original. So my process again, start to finish, and once more, I'm going to reiterate that this is just my process, and this is just my view on how to plot a book. There are 100, other books out there, courses out there are going to tell you how to do it differently, and that's fine. You don't have to agree with my method. This is just the one that works for me. And take what you want out of it and leave the rest behind if it doesn't work for you. But I come up with a concept, premise, characters first, then I come up with a theme, and then I decide how the books end. Then I figure out the first twist, the last twist. Then I get from the first twist to the crisis, which is the middle, and then I decide how to start. Because if I know the ending, I know the best place to start. And that's when I actually begin writing. And once again, if this structure stuff is your thing, then get these books. Because if you're relating to these videos, all of this came right out of these books, and you're going to get a lot more out of them than you are these videos, I think. So don't be afraid to go and give them a try. And if you don't like one of them, try the other one. Try one at a time. If you're not super into structure, I would recommend the Plot Whisperer first. If you want an excellent breakdown of story structure for the film story Silence of the Lambs, that's in the Story Grid. And story engineering is just one of my favorites, even though it's a little bit wordy. It really makes a lot of sense to me. So coming up, we have done beginnings, middles, and scenes, hooks, and endings. And next time we're going to do point of view and characters, which is probably one of my very, very favorite things to do. So I can't wait to get that one up. So again, if you don't want to check back every week, there's a little form at the end of this post where you can put in your email and you'll be notified every time I put up a video. And it just makes it easier so you don't have to remember to come back every 2 weeks, not every week, every 2 weeks, because these are releasing every 2 weeks on Wednesday. Okay, that's it. And again, if you have any questions, just leave a comment. And as soon as I see it, I'll give it an answer. Thanks for stopping by, and I hope you got something from this.